Hi and welcome back. So this video is going to be chapter 3, really looking deeper into the structures of the brain. So chapter 3, the beautiful brain. In this chapter we're going to talk about the sections and the areas of the brain that seem to be most involved in ADHD. So the frontal lobe or prefrontal cortex, the limbic system, the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, and the cerebellum. And first we're going to talk about the limbic system. So here you have an image of the limbic system, and the section that's colored in the middle is the limbic system. Limbic means border. The limbic system is also called the reptile brain, the midbrain, or the little brain. And it's between the cortex, which is the outer section where we have all the curly cues there. That's the cortex. And the brainstem, which is, the section that then comes down and becomes our spinal cord. So its primary function is our survival and survival of the species. There's no thinking about the future in this part of the brain. Not long term, anyway. The limbic system has several different structures within it, some of which are labeled here, that have their own jobs. So let's go through them. So, the limbic system. First, let's talk about the thalamus. The thalamus is a circle right in the middle of the limbic system, and it's like the operator of a switchboard. All input comes in from the senses and everywhere, and that goes directly to the thalamus first, and then the thalamus sends those signals to alert the other structures of the limbic system. They also sends the signals up to the prefrontal cortex, but those signals take a long time to get up there. They're almost instantaneous to the rest of the limbic system. And then you have the amygdala. The amygdala is the emotional center of the brain. The amygdala, we actually have two amygdala, one on each hemisphere, and they're like an almond-shaped organ, and this is where emotions arise. A stimulus comes in, the thalamus sends it to the amygdala will label it as a threat, not a threat, or something or someone to be aroused by. This is the fight, flight, freeze, or FUC reproduce system, okay? The amygdala is where emotions come from. It's where we get fear and anxiety and arousal of being attracted to people and so on. The next is the hippocampus. The hippocampus is an area of memory storage, and it's right next to the amygdala. The amygdala and the hippocampus work together to label stimuli, and then the amygdala asks the hippocampus, have we experienced this before, or anything similar? Was it good or was it bad? And so this is where memories become stored. Then you have the anterior cingulate gyrus, and this kind of like wraps all the way around the limbic system, around the top, and it almost interfaces with the bottom side of the cortex. And this area of the limbic system is kind of like the watchdog. It's paying attention to all inputs from every sensory area, as well as the senses from within your body, such as your own thoughts or your heart rate, how you're breathing, your body temperature, etc. And then you have the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia, which isn't often labeled on images of the limbic system. It's maybe even kind of its own system. But this section of our brain sends the signals directly to the brainstem and thus out to the muscles based on what the hippocampus and the amygdala have decided. Do we fight? Do we run? Do we freeze? Or do we get excited and aroused? The limbic system is act before you think. It's responsible for your ability to pull your hand back from a hot skillet before you even have a chance to say ouch. There's no thinking, just action. You don't have to think about it. The limbic system operates in the now and can draw on from the past, but there's no long-term planning here, which is what makes it similar to how a reptile's brain functions. What do we want or feel right now? Emotions emerge here. They are interpreted somewhere else. And that would be in the prefrontal cortex. So let's move on now to the outer area of the brain, the cortex. And we'll talk about all the sections there. So here in this image, I have circled the area of the frontal cortex, which is called the prefrontal cortex. And this is just a small section. It's right above your eyes. And having a prefrontal cortex is one of the things that sets us apart from the animal kingdom. The prefrontal cortex is the most recent area of the human brain to evolve. And if you recall, early man and early woman, they weren't making any long-term plans or contemplating their life choices, right? Early man was mostly limbic system. Just like babies and toddlers are pretty much all limbic system. Everything is based on emotion. It's based on our senses. It's based on what's happening in the environment now and maybe what we've learned from past experiences somewhat. And it's all about fight, flight, freeze, or reproduce. But as humans evolved, so did our brains. We developed a thinking brain, and that's what the prefrontal cortex is. The prefrontal cortex serves as the rational consultant to our limbic system as long as it's online and functioning properly. But it can be overridden or not consulted at all, especially during any kind of threatening or traumatic situation. The limbic system can completely take over to ensure our survival so that we don't have to think about a decision about whether to fight, flight, freeze, etc. But this is the area of our brain that allows us to weigh current actions against long-term consequences and goals. The prefrontal cortex develops as we age, and most research says that people have a fully developed prefrontal cortex by around age 26. I tend to believe that the prefrontal cortex continues to mature for the majority of a person's lifetime until, some sort of dementia or degeneration sets in. So what are the other sections of the brain here? So then you have the motor cortex, which is just above the prefrontal cortex. And the motor cortex does what you think it does. This is where we get the signals to our body to actually move. This is where movement happens. And then you have the temporal lobe, which is right above your ear. And the temporal lobe is responsible for understanding language and understanding emotions. So again, emotions emerge in the limbic system, but we interpret them, put language to them, and understand them in our parietal lobe, as well as in the frontal cortex, prefrontal cortex. But it also coordinates with the hippocampus for memory. Then you have the parietal lobe, which is, up here towards the back above and behind your ear. And the parietal lobe is what helps us take in our senses. It helps us process all of the input, like it sort of coordinates all of the input from the rest of the areas of the cortex. And it monitors our position in space and time. Our understanding of time happens in the parietal lobe. And then finally you have the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is really what's responsible for coordination. And it also has a role in attention and language and some aspects of emotional control. So that's kind of like the brain in a nutshell. And reflection here is, how well do you think your prefrontal cortex is doing with being the rational counterpart to your limbic system? Can you recall a recent time where you stopped and thought before you acted on an impulse? And if you can recall that, you can thank your prefrontal cortex for that. So that's been chapter 3. I'll see you in chapter 4.